Welcome to Shield of the Republic, a podcast sponsored by the Bulwark and the Miller Center of Public Affairs, and dedicated to the proposition first articulated by Walter Lippmann during World War II that a healthy foreign policy is the shield of our democratic republic. I'm Eric Edelman. I'm a contributor to the Bulwark and a counselor at the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments, as well as an occasional professor at the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. And I want to welcome back my partner in crime and strategery, Eliot Cohen. Eliot, welcome back.
Eric, it's good to be with you. I'm also teach at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, and have a chair in strategy at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and that's enough of titles. This week, Eric, it's just you and me, mano a mano.
The click and clack of national security affairs. We're going to do something a little different for this episode of Shield of the Republic. We're going to start with the secret origin story of how Eliot and Eric came to know one another and to feel that they needed to do a podcast to share their views with the rest of the entire universe. So, Eliot, I think the way we met was through a common teacher, the late Al Bernstein, who was a student of one of my teachers at Yale, the late Don Kagan, and was also teaching at Yale when I was a graduate student from Cornell, where he spent a lot of his time as a professor before going on to the Naval War College, where he met you. Why don't you pick up the story of Al from there?
Yeah, so I first encountered Al Bernstein actually when I was in a summer program at Cornell between my junior and senior years, and they brought in this young associate professor of ancient history to give us a lecture about Roman strategy, and he was mesmerizing. Well, fast forward, there I am, and I'm an assistant professor at Harvard, and I got a call from this fellow named Al Bernstein at the U.S. Naval War College. He was the chairman of the strategy department. He invited me in to give a lecture to the class. And then the next thing I know, I had a job offer, and I left Harvard to go work for Al for the next 4 years before coming permanently to Washington. And I followed him to Washington to work in the then newly created policy planning staff of the Department of Defense. And I vividly remember Al saying, "You two guys need to know each other. You're going to be like brothers." And it took off. It took off from there. He was a wonderful man, really. He was an ancient historian. He could always dial up the Brooklyn, but of course he was a Cornell, Yale, Oxford educated ancient historian. He was a magnificent teacher, and he was a really inspiring leader. He was a guy who had his flaws, but also someone who was a joy to work with. And he inspires me down to the current day.
Yeah, it's true. Honestly, rarely a day goes by where I don't think about Al. He was one of the three great teachers to whom I referred in the introduction to my PhD dissertation at Yale, along with Walter Lefebvre, another great teacher who was in the same history department, actually, as Al at Cornell. And, I still think about Al kind of perched on my shoulder occasionally, counseling me, not just on matters historical, but on matters personal and other things. He was really a remarkable person.
Yeah, and he was courageous. He lived through Cornell during some very difficult times in the late 60s. It was one of the reasons why he had a truly magnetic sort of relationship with the officers at the Naval War College. They could tell there was a kindred spirit. And he's still very much an inspiration. It's in a way, he's an inspiration indirectly, in the sense that you realize when you encounter somebody like Al and you look back on them 20, 30 years later, what an impact they had. And that encourages you to do your best as a teacher or as a boss, because you may not fully understand the impact that you have on somebody who's just starting out. And it can be quite profound, the way Al's was. So there we were in the policy planning staff of the Defense Department. We overlapped rather briefly, and then we ended up working together later on in the George W. Bush administration. Maybe you want to talk a little bit about what we did there.
Yeah, I was in 2005 serving as U.S. ambassador to Turkey when I got a phone call from Donald Rumsfeld asking me if I would like to come back and be considered for the position of Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. And I did come back and interview with Rumsfeld, and somewhat to my surprise, because I didn't think the interview went that well, I was offered the job. And then about a year and a half later, as I recall, you called me and told me that Condoleezza Rice, the then Secretary of State, had asked you to come be her counselor, which I was extremely enthusiastic about, delighted to have you as an interagency partner. And the two of us actually got to do a lot of work together, because both of us, I think, were concentrating our time on Iraq and Afghanistan, understandably. And the result was that we got to travel together quite a bit, both to Iraq and Afghanistan, but also to London and Paris, where we both put in a lot of effort trying to repair a lot of the relationships that had been damaged by the Iraq War, and get those alliance relations back into the kind of shape that they needed to be in.
Yeah. And I will say, during that experience, you taught me a lot about what it is to do alliance maintenance, and a kind of critical diplomacy that I think most people are not aware of. I often tell people that by the end of the George W. Bush administration, in its second term, we were actually on great terms with the French, which is the case. And you deserve a disproportionate share of the credit for that. We got to work together on a couple of crises, including when we discovered that North Korean nuclear reactor in Syria. That was an education in itself. We got to try to mop up the damage after the intelligence community decided to release a national intelligence estimate on Iran that A, I think was wrong, and B, ended up blindsiding our allies. And then we just spent a lot of time, towards the end of the day, when we were both frustrated, what was the machine called? A Tandberg would flash into life, and there you were complaining about some of the people you had to deal with, and I was complaining about some of the people I had to deal with.
So the bottom line, of course, ended up being that you asked me to come join you at Johns Hopkins SAIS after I left government, after we both left government at the end of the Bush 43 administration, and actually was one of the greatest examples of bait and switch ever, because you offered to team teach a course with me, which you did for all of one semester, before then throwing me in the deep end and saying, okay, over to you, pal, you can do all this teaching on your own now. Although I have to say, I learned a lot from a master teacher about how to teach a class. And so I'm grateful that you at least gave me the opportunity to do that before, making me solo.
Well, I figured you could handle it. So we learned a lot from each other in a variety of ways. I think we're also quite similar in that we are quite deeply rooted in history. You have your PhD in history. I wish that's where my PhD were, but I've certainly done a lot of work in it. In the intellectual history of the 20th century, I remember on those flights, particularly to Europe, it would just be like a floating seminar about all kinds of things, both contemporary and historical. And that was also part of my education, at least. I'm curious, Eric. Obviously, we disagree about various things, usually at the margins. I don't think we've had a really fundamental disagreement on foreign policy that I can remember. But if you were to say, what do we have in common in terms of a way of understanding the world? And then maybe we can apply that prism to some of the things that we're looking at today, including even the record of the Biden administration.
I think the thing that we share most, Eliot, is a sensibility. And it is a historian sensibility. I know you joke all the time that you're a historian trapped in the body of a political scientist, but I think you have always in your written work, and I certainly in what I've done in government, have appreciated that it's impossible to understand present predicaments without understanding their origins and understanding the past. And more broadly, that a study of the past truly is, as I think it was John Seeley who said in the Victorian era, the school of statesmanship. Not because history provides you with a cookie cutter that allows you to, replicate, from different past historical experiences, prescriptions for what one should do now. In that sense, history, I don't believe, is a policy science. It's not prescriptive, but it does give you a range of different human responses to different kinds of situations, and helps you, I think, reach better judgments about what people might or might not do in specific situations that you have to face in government. And in that sense, I think we both had the experience from kind of different ends of the telescope of having both the historical experience and knowledge, and then the practical application at various points in our lives. And that's, to me, the thing that has bound us together.
Yeah, I think two other things. One is, I would say, and my own limited government experience has very much reinforced this. I would say my experience as a dean, that you really see the importance of personality to include character, and you acquire a respect for contingency, that things don't have to turn out in a certain way. And it's one of the things that has made me more and more wary of, particularly of attempts to reduce foreign policy and international affairs to very simple and abstract political science dicta. I think history teaches you just the reverse, and practical experience even more so. I think the other thing, and this is, again, this may lead us into discussing some of the issues of the day, is without, on the one hand, being wild-eyed idealists, we both have a very strong sense of the moral dimension of foreign policy, while at the same time understanding the world is what the world is, and one has to be realistic about it. I mean, you have a whole bunch of proverbs, which I often quote, usually with attribution. Things like that: the art of diplomacy is the art of saying "nice doggy" while you look around for a rock. And I think that's one of the things that is hardest to keep in balance. That awareness that on the one hand, there has to be a moral dimension for a whole bunch of reasons. You wouldn't want to be Talleyrand or Metternich. But in any case, if you're an American, you really can't be, because that's just not the nature of our system. On the other hand, you do have to deal with the world as it is, and you do have to deal with imperfect solutions, and sometimes even with moral compromises. And that's, to my mind, that's one of the most interesting things about American foreign policy, more than the foreign policy of most other countries. We have to balance both.
I agree with that. And on the personality side, I think you and I have both had this conversation, which is that when you think about the various meetings we attended in the Situation Room, meetings of the principals, the National Security Council principals, or the deputies, the sub-cabinet level members, that if you went around the room and put a little cartoon bubble over everybody's head with their IQ, the variance would be very minor. Everybody in there, with a few exceptions, is usually pretty smart. But if you had that same cartoon bubble over their heads with their emotional intelligence quotient, the variance would be a lot greater. And so the role that personality plays in this really, can't be gainsaid, I don't think, at all. It's hugely important. The other thing I admire about you, and you won't be surprised by this, I think, is that you're really a polymath. I mean, again, you're a political scientist by trade, but your interests are very Catholic with a small c, which is why you're now writing a book about Shakespeare and strategy. So, and as you know, from indulging me on our trips to Paris, where I tried to buy up every possible work, written by Raymond Daron, the great French scholar, strategist, and polymath, I deeply admire people who have that kind of intellectual breadth.
Well, I could sling the compliment back at you in the same way, but I do think let's maybe go a bit beyond mutual admiration, however sincere. Look, I do think it's true that both of us have this commitment to high Western culture, particularly the culture of the last 20th century, and just in terms of things like our reading tastes and so on, and the degree of background knowledge that we feel one has to have in order to think clearly about foreign policy, and not just Western cultures, but all cultures. The need to be intellectually broad and as deep as one can be. And like you, I always feel somewhat inadequate, and that's why you and I would always be going into bookstores and coming back with loads of books and trying to smuggle them in past our suspicious wives. But I think it's fair to say that that's going to be less and less common in the future. I mean, we are the product of really, in some ways, the middle of the last century, in terms of who our teachers were, even who our parents were, what our reading habits were. Do you think I'm being too harsh if I say that the policymakers of the future are probably less likely to be deeply read in that broad cultural way, or am I just being a snob?
Well, I think I think there's two sides to the story. I think there's still pockets of this that exist, including at places like SAIS, where there's an effort to instruct students in that kind of approach intellectually to the problems of national security affairs. But I think there's been also a secular decline in the secondary education system. So people don't read history. Undergraduates don't, by and large, major in history. If you look at the numbers of students majoring in history has dropped dramatically over the last 20 to 30 years. So I do think there are going to be challenges going forward as people try to bring to bear some of that. You probably recall that in the closing passage of the late Charlie Hill's book on grand strategy, he quotes Henry Kissinger saying to him, "Well, who reads books anymore?" And I mean, I don't think Dr. Kissinger would mind my recounting that when you and I were putting together our first course, Diplomatic Disasters at SAIS, and you told him that we were going to be, among other things, studying the second Moroccan crisis, he said to you, Eliot, who studies the second Moroccan crisis anymore? So, I mean, I think he said that admiringly, but
He did actually. I mean, he was pleased by it. But look, it's also true that our reading habits were shaped and were thoroughly formed before the internet became a thing. And this is not a pejorative comment about people who are younger, but just the fact is most people are acquiring their information by doing a lot of surfing of the internet with all of its extraordinary riches of things to read. And that's not the same thing as plowing through a stack of books. I want to go back to something that we were talking about earlier, and maybe I can use this as a segue to get us talking about the world of today. One of the things I took away from my experience of working with you in government was so much depends. I decided I didn't agree with that famous Graham Allison dictum, where you stand depends on where you sit. In other words, that bureaucratic positioning really determines the positions you take. And instead, it seemed to me that government is driven much more by leagues of like-minded people who, yes, will have different vantage points. State and defense will not always agree on all sorts of things. But if you have people who have similar sets of values, a similar frame of reference, in some ways you're going to be a lot better off because you can coordinate things a lot better. And I really do feel that was the experience of the last few years of the Bush administration, not just where I personally or you personally was involved. A, do you agree with that? But B, I'm curious to know, what do you think from what you can tell now of the Biden team? And how would you assess them from that point of view?
It's a great question. And so first on the general point, the picture that people have sometimes of the interagency process when it's described in government is of these sort of titanic clashes, between defense and state, or between the NSC and, some other, the CIA or some other, agency or element of the government. And I always, during the course of my career, tried to be aware of the fact that every day there were going to be a panoply of new subjects, on the agenda. And someone who might be my bureaucratic ally one day was going to be, on the other side the next day, but maybe back on my side on some other subject. And so tried to paraphrase Palmerston, I tried to have no permanent enemies. I mean, I didn't have permanent allies either, but I tried to have no permanent enemies in government and to try and work with people who were like-minded on different issues to try and accomplish different things. So I do agree. On the more specific question of the Biden team, I will confess that I've been a little bit surprised that they have not done quite as well over the course of the first year as certainly I hoped they would do, but even as I anticipated they would do. And maybe we can get into some of the reasons why their performance has been perhaps less than some of the parts, in the sense that all of the people are bright, capable, have experience at senior levels. Yet the performance has been, sort of just less than one might have hoped. And I think there are a couple of reasons for that. I'd be interested in whether you agree with that. Let me just start with one. I think that the team that President Biden has arrayed around himself is not a team of rivals, as Doris Kearns Goodwin famously depicted Lincoln's Civil War cabinet, and as President Obama tried to create by, bringing Hillary Clinton on and having Joe Biden as his vice president, and others who had been, in politics with him. This is really a team that is by and large united by personal service to Joe Biden. And in that sense, it's sort of, rather than a presidential national security team, it's sort of the greatest Senate staff ever. And I'm not sure that model works when you're trying to execute a policy, in part because I don't think there's anybody in that group who's a peer of the president who can walk in and say, Mr. President, you either really screwed something up here, or what you're proposing really is going to take us in the wrong direction. We need to think about X, Y, or Z. And I'm just curious whether you agree with any or all of that.
Yeah, I agree with that. I've never quite liked the team of rivals phrasing because, frankly, they caused Lincoln an enormous set of headaches. I mean, he had some very, very strong personalities who were soon united by a devotion to him. And the ones I would pick out would be William Seward, the Secretary of State, and then later on Stanton, the Secretary of War, both of whom had their own ambitions, but really pushed those aside in commitment to Lincoln. But the point is there that I think Lincoln could accept and felt perfectly comfortable with people who were strong personalities who would be laying out different views, sometimes opposed views. And then he was, quite comfortable then making a decision. I don't get the sense that Biden wants that. There have been presidents who have. I think the one who never gets nearly enough credit is Gerald Ford, who had some extremely strong personalities in his cabinet who disagreed with one another, including, of course, there's George Shultz, who was a forceful character, and Kissinger and others. And
Schlesinger and Rumsfeld. There was no shortage of powerful figures there.
Right. And he made it clear that was just fine. I don't think Biden does that. And so I'm like you, I'm disappointed. I think Biden turns out to be more stubborn, more willful, more certain that he is right, more testy, I think, than I anticipated. And I don't know if that's personality or age, which it could be. I think we all get a little bit testier the older we get. But whatever it is, I think that's that is missing. And I think when you go through the personalities one by one, as admirable as they may be as individuals, they're not likely to do that. I mean, Tony Blinken, very bright, very charming, right views on a lot of things. Still, he worked for Biden this whole time, and
right.
That doesn't make you the one who's likely to say you're wrong. Lloyd Austin, good, solid, loyal general. That doesn't mean that you're going to be a Caspar Weinberger or somebody like that, or Don Rumsfeld or Dick Cheney, and so on. So, I think that's really,
or Bob Gates.
There's also there's another dysfunction, though, which I find a little bit more concerning, and that is that they just don't seem to be welded into a team. So, for example, I think, like you, I suspect, I was very much in favor of AUKUS, this deal with Australia and the UK, that Australia should have nuclear submarines. Makes perfect strategic sense. There's no question about that.
Best thing they've done since they've been in office.
It was a great move, and it was initiated by somebody we both know well, Kurt Campbell, who's terrific. But we did it at the expense of really dissing the French, who can be difficult, but are also extremely valuable allies and have had a reason to feel displeased about it. And nobody has said this to me, but the sense that I get is that within the administration, the attitude is, well, okay, this is Indo-Pacific shop at the White House's policy. This is not our problem. Well, it's a whole of government problem by definition whenever you do it. Now, the one thing I will say, though, is when I look at the Ukraine crisis that we've been living through, it seems to me they've been better on that score. I mean, it feels more, as the British would say, joined up. And I think that's because it really is potentially an extremely serious crisis that has everybody's attention focused and not just an opportunity to do something smart.
I generally agree with that. Let me make a couple of points. One, on the AUKUS deal, which I completely agree with you, is just a real achievement, a great accomplishment, but flawed by the failure to really do due diligence on the ramifications with other allies, notably including the French. And here's why I think that was such a mistake. First, you could imagine the argument being made, and I would suspect Kurt, if he were with us, would make this argument. In the end of the day, who cares what the French think? They're not really a big player here. But I do think, the French are an Indo-Pacific power. They've got overseas domains, and they've got a lot of citizens there. They've got some military forces there. So if we want, as we should, the EU to be lined up with us in dealing with China, part of the answer is going to be getting the French, on our side and have them help us get the rest of the Europeans aligned. Secondly, as you know well, Eliot, the U.S. Navy relies on highly enriched uranium for its nuclear propulsion. And it is already facing some problems with the limits of access to highly enriched uranium in order to propel our submarines into the future. I can't imagine that the submarines that Australia is going to build are going to be powered by HEU. They're more likely going to be powered by LEU, in part because of the proliferation concerns that people have about HEU being in the hands of a country like Australia, which did at one point have, a nuclear program and considered its own independent nuclear deterrent as late as the 1970s. And guess what the French, nuclear subs are powered by? LEU. So, with just a little bit of time and attention, there was a potential win-win-win here that could have been orchestrated that would have made this much smoother, better, I think, outcome. So that's point one on the AUKUS. On the Russia-Ukraine part, I certainly agree that as we sit here today, in sort of late January, that they have done reasonably well, particularly the last few days. I do think it started a little rockier when you think back on the whole administration's 1 year term. I think they very much wanted to try and put kind of Russia to one side so that they could focus on China. That's part of their interim strategic guidance, the real long pole in the tent of strategic competition is with China. And for instance, they've tried to rebrand all of this. So in the late Obama administration, Secretary of Defense Ash Carter started talking about the return of great power competition, even though the White House told him to stop talking about that. And in the Trump administration, that was very explicitly the framing for the national security strategy and national defense strategy of the Trump administration, great power competition. The Biden administration has tried to kind of rephrase it as long-term strategic competition without, any great powers being in it. Obviously, it's all kind of aimed at China. And I think there are a couple of downsides to that. One, it provokes a sentiment among people like Putin in Russia about what about us? We still matter. We're still a great power. And I think, offering Putin a summit without, any requirement on his part to do anything constructive was maybe not the smartest thing to do. I worry that their initial rollover of the New START treaty for 5 years rather than a 1 or 2 year rollover, as other people had advised, including the state and defense departments at the beginning of the administration, was probably seen as a concession for nothing to the Russians, which, suggested maybe a certain kind of pliability that, is now creating other repercussions for them. So I think they started weak, but I think their performance has gotten a lot better over the last 2 months, certainly. And they've been helped by Putin.
So that's for sure. I want to seize on just one of the things you said, because as you know, I have my hobby horses, and I always appreciate an opportunity to saddle up and ride one. And that is that to some extent were they blindsided because they were as focused as they were on China, and quite appropriately so. And one of the things that I've been thinking about recently, I'm writing a long piece about this, is there has been a vogue in American foreign policy thinking, really in some ways going back to the Cold War, but particularly pronounced after the Cold War, to try to think very abstractly about foreign policy. And I view the current rage for grand strategy as being along those lines. And to give away the money graph, as they say from this piece that I'm writing, at one point I say, to paraphrase Mike Tyson, who said that everybody has a plan until they get punched in the mouth. Well, everybody has a grand strategy until Vladimir Putin mobilizes 125,000 troops on the borders of Ukraine. And I think that, what that speaks to is, in a way, a misunderstanding of what it's going to take for the United States to successfully navigate this extremely turbulent and uncertain world in which we live, where we just have to be very quick on our feet and nimble and adjusting, and it'll be more like judo, I think, than building a bridge. You're going to have to deal with the player that comes at you, and you're going to have to take advantage of the opportunities he gives you and try to mitigate your weaknesses. And I think we're just really not. We're not. That's not how we think about it, and we're not particularly good at it.
Well, and not to put too fine a point on it, Putin, if you know his biography, is a judo master. So that's
yeah.
That's
yeah. Although, by the way, on this one, I think he's. I don't think this will end well for Russia or for Putin.
I agree with that.
I want to go back to something else. Said high enriched uranium made me think of another one of our favorite topics, and that's the JCPOA and the Iranian nuclear program. You and I spent a lot of time periodically being undercut by our own government, trying to mobilize sanctions and so forth. But I'm not sure you and I ever had a really definitive conversation about, okay, what do we think is actually doable vis-a-vis the Iranian regime and nuclear weapons? We know we don't like the JCPOA, which is the Iran deal that the Obama administration cut. We both disliked it. We both think the Iranians are really bad actors throughout the Middle East and the Persian Gulf. They're Houthi rebels in Yemen firing ballistic missiles at Abu Dhabi. I don't think that technology was invented in the deserts of Yemen. We could go on.
And Houthi leaders were in Tehran when it happened, so it's hard to imagine that there was no
a coincidence, I'm sure.
Exactly. So, look, it's a great question, because we are where we are now, and it's getting harder and harder, I think, to imagine putting the toothpaste back in the tube, given the level of enrichment that Iran has. Back in the day, when we were working on this in Bush 43, and that is now, 13, 14, 15 even years ago, our colleague Steve Hadley used to say there were two time clocks running. There was the time clock of change in Iran because of concern of the Iranian people with the regime, their disillusionment and more with the clerical regime. And then the other time clock was the nuclear time clock, as Iran mastered the various technologies that are required to have a nuclear weapon. And luckily, that, of course, building a nuclear weapon, thank God, is rocket science. And it's not so much that the science is a mystery to people, but the engineering is actually quite demanding. And that has given us, maybe more time than some people would have anticipated. But I still think that those two time clocks are kind of operative. I still think that the regime is deeply unpopular. I think we haven't done nearly enough to exploit that, to encourage Iranians who have historically taken things into their own hands, going back to the beginning of the 20th century, to replace regimes that were authoritarian and autocratic, including the overthrow of the Shah in 1979. And, we frankly are, with Russia, with China, and with Iran, going back to the show that we taped with your CSIS colleague, Seth Jones, those three countries are actively waging political warfare against the United States. And we have unilaterally disarmed in that dimension. And my view is we ought to be waging political warfare against all three of them.
So I as you and I frequently say to each other, I agree with that, every element of that, including the commas, the ands, and the thus. But here's the irony in all that. Quite sincerely, I believe, the Russians are convinced that the color revolutions and all that in Eastern Europe were the result of careful, adroit, cunning, effective American political warfare. And I dare say that there are parallel beliefs in Iran and China. We did do some of that during the Cold War. You think about our support for solidarity, not just the US government, but making effective use of things like the AFL-CIO to support the Polish labor movement. The irony, of course, though, is that no, we haven't been doing that in any systematic way. There is no reason why we couldn't, and why we couldn't do it actually quite effectively, because at the end of the day, the product that we have to sell, rule of law, liberty, transparency, it's a much better product than they have to sell. And I quite agree with you. I think we're heading into a period which I believe is extremely dangerous, and certainly one where America's enemies are in some ways stronger and in some ways better positioned than they've been in decades and decades. But so there has to be a process of rearmament. I think that's the only way you can describe it. But it's a different kind of rearmament. And one part of it absolutely should be figuring out, okay, what's the equivalent of USIA, for example, the United States Information Agency? Things like Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, all that stuff. It all means something very different in the internet age, but there are unquestionably things that we can do to put those regimes on the back foot, and we should. But I still want to pin you down on Iran. Which clock is running faster?
Well, right now the nuclear clock's running faster. There is a kind of facile, I think, answer that some people have, which is, well, we'll just have to learn to live with a nuclear Iran, because after all, we lived with the Soviet Union bristling with nuclear weapons, and we managed to deter and contain them. And so we'll just have to do the same thing with Iran. And it has to be easy, right? Because Iran is a lot smaller than the Soviet Union. It's not at the head of an international movement the way the Soviets were, although the Iranians may think they're at the head of an international movement. And so I think that is, I would say, the prevailing conventional wisdom that exists about this. Where I think it goes wrong is that in the first instance, the problem is not going to be a nuclear balance between the United States with 1,550 warheads and Iran, which will have at the outset, 10, 15, 20, maybe 100 nuclear warheads. But the reality will be a very unstable nuclear balance between Iran and Israel. And then the knock-on effects, what a Senate Foreign Relations Committee report a number of years ago referred to as the chain reaction, which will lead to Saudi Arabia, UAE, maybe Egypt, maybe even Turkey developing their own nuclear capabilities, which will make the region more dangerous, less manageable, and raise, I think, the potential that nuclear weapons will actually get used. You're talking about a bunch of countries living cheek by jowl. It's not like 30 minutes of flight time by ballistic missile from the Soviet Union to the United States in the Cold War. You're talking about 4 to 5 minutes, and from launch to and detection to impact. And so the odds of nuclear weapons being used in anger in a very crucial part of the world seem to me to be likely to go up exponentially if Iran actually ends up getting that nuclear weapon. I think people are not thinking through the potential downsides and consequences very clearly.
Yeah, there's also the psychological consequences. I mean, if an Iranian regime with nuclear weapons, I think, is one that feels protected in a way to do the other things that it wants to do.
But it's already doing. It's already trying to subvert all of its neighbors.
But I think they'll be willing to take further risks, and there's everything that could follow. One, just to pull on another thread here. We talked a bit about political warfare and so on. One of the challenges. One of the reasons why one simply can't rely on the Iranian regime, or for that matter, the Russian regime, to collapse of its own accord, despite the fact that they, are economically unsuccessful and corrupt and repressive and all that. The thought that strikes me is that what the Greeks would call the techne of repression has gotten so much more sophisticated, whether it's technology or organization or tactics. And the bad guys share this stuff, and they're very good at it. I mean, the Chinese for sure, but also the Russians, and indeed the Iranians. And that, I think, unfortunately, is one of the lessons of the last major set of demonstrations that you had in Iran well over a decade ago. Was I interviewed a former student of mine who happened to be there on the ground. And I was just really struck by his description of just how professionally and effectively the police went about nabbing leaders and controlling crowds, intimidating people. They don't have to rely on mass terror in quite the same way that they did before. You look at the Chinese regime, which is extremely repressive. They're just extremely skilled at doing things like pressuring people through their families, all kinds of financial things they can do, and so forth. And that I don't think we've fully accepted that. There is a kind of naive belief that the good guys are always bound to win because they're the good guys. And perhaps this is another view that we share: is the good guys don't necessarily win because they're the good guys.
Yeah, I mean, this goes back obviously to the show we had with our mutual friend Ann Applebaum. The bad guys are winning right now for many of the reasons you just articulated. I think we've been complacent because the information revolution beginning in the 1980s, the telecommunications revolution, was an important part in undermining the Soviet Union and bringing the Cold War to an end without anybody firing a shot, with essentially our adversary, collapsing. A lot of that had to do with people in the Eastern Bloc and in the Soviet Union. Some of it had to do with things we did to help empower them. Some of it had to do with circumstances we created through controlling technology that got into the East Bloc, etc. But I think it led to a sort of facile conclusion that all these technologies ultimately, benefit the good guys. And as you just said, the current circumstance seems to be that whatever that might have happened in the 80s and 90s, the bad guys have figured out how to make the technology actually work for them, rather than for the dissidents and for the folks who want to see freedom and democracy and liberty and all those good things happen to their societies. Eliot, I want to go to one other issue that we haven't talked about, but I kind of think is almost the elephant in the room about the first year of the Biden administration, and that's Afghanistan. Both you and I spent a lot of time in government on Afghanistan in the Bush 43 administration when we were working together, traveled there together. First, how did you feel? I mean, I really want to, typically we don't talk about our emotions on this, but I know that I went through a lot of emotional turmoil in August over this, and I'm just curious whether you did the same.
I usually don't lose sleep over international events. I had trouble sleeping that week. I had trouble sleeping for a couple of reasons. One, I kept on thinking about people who I knew and respected, Afghans, who I'd met on my trips over there, and think to myself, my God, they're probably going to get killed or tortured and then killed. And then I had just wrenching exchanges with former students who had served there. In fact, with his permission, I published a piece in The Atlantic, which was a letter from a former student who had been over there in a really difficult place and lost friends, trying to make sense of it. It's not the first time that foreign policy has touched me personally. And I mean, the first time was when my oldest son went off in a light infantry brigade to Iraq, to fight a war that I'd been in favor of, but at a time when I didn't think the war was going well and was saying as much. And I think, part of the challenge for us and part of the behavior we have to model for those who are coming on behind us is, on the one hand, to accept the emotional turmoil and not run away from it, and not deny it or suppress it, but then also be able to step back and be analytic. And that takes a lot of effort. So what I found myself with Afghanistan, I was angry and deeply upset and deeply saddened on the one hand. And then I also tried to step back and say, okay, well, what does this mean? And why did this happen? I guess my feeling about it was, you're tempted to say these people are idiots. They're awful. And I don't actually think that was the case. I think this was not an act of weakness. By the way, I think is a mistake that Putin is making in his assessment of Biden. The withdrawal from Afghanistan was not about weakness. It was not about a lack of backbone. It was the consummation of a position that he had long held, and there was even a kind of strategic reasoning for it in terms of kind of clearing the decks so you could focus on the really big challenge, which was China and to some extent now Russia. And the implementation of it, which was, and I distinguish very clearly in my own mind between the decision to liquidate the Afghan commitment, which I think was a bad decision, but was one which I understand. And reasonable people like our friend Carter Malkasian disagree about that. And the execution and the decision, when to do it, and the unreadiness of the State Department and the way we dealt with our allies, that's a very different matter. And that was just appallingly badly handled. And it was an act of systemic incompetence by highly intelligent people, some of whom are quite experienced. And that's it's hard to wrap your head around the compatibility of those two things, but I think one has to. So those are my somewhat incoherent reactions. What were yours, and what are yours now?
Yeah, I mean, I went through a lot of turmoil as well. I was in the process of trying to help a number of people get in contact with various U.S. government agencies trying to extricate people from Afghanistan. I mean, I obviously disagreed with the decision. I understand, as you laid out, the rationale for it, and it's clearly something that Biden had been committed to for a long time. My suspicion is that in the administration, most people accepted the fact that it was unlikely that absent U.S. support that the Afghan regime would survive. But I think they thought they had more time and that they could have what was described during the Vietnam era, when the Nixon administration was trying to extricate the U.S. from Vietnam, as a decent interval between the withdrawal of U.S. combat forces and the collapse, of the regime. But what I can't kind of get around is I know that from talking to folks in government that as this was all playing out, the intelligence community was continuously shortening its timelines. And there's no doubt that they were telling people that. And moreover, it should have been clear to people that the Afghan security forces couldn't survive without some of the things that we provided, like contractor support and, absolutely critical mission planning capabilities that we have that are kind of unique, but which we trained the Afghans to rely on in order to fight. And not to mention, of course, air power, airstrikes, et cetera. So we kind of, to me, putting on my historian's hat for a second, I'm one of the few people in government who had Bob Comer as a predecessor. He was, my predecessor as ambassador to Turkey, and he was my predecessor as Undersecretary of Defense, multiple times removed in both instances. But he wrote a very famous study for RAND called Bureaucracy Does Its Thing, about how we trained the Army of the Republic of Vietnam. And basically what he said is we tried to create a little miniature U.S. Army in Vietnam, disregarding the differences in culture and their ability to fight the way we do, et cetera. And, here we are, sort of 40 to 50 years later, and we've done exactly the same thing. And it should have been obvious. It was obvious to you and me when we were going out there that there was no way that the Afghan security forces could operate without the continued partnership, not necessarily in combat directly, but without the partnership of the U.S. military forces. And to me, that was the great failure of imagination, to understand that the Army would just collapse absent the infrastructure we had created for it, which we pulled out overnight. And the way we did it, leaving Bagram essentially in the middle of the night and throwing them the car keys, I think brought a lot of dishonor to the country.
It was dishonorable. And it grieves me to say that. I think both you and I accept the United States will make mistakes, even big mistakes, but we don't like to think the United States will do things that are dishonorable. I am reminded, what was that saying of Al's that you always used to quote? I'm thinking now of this assumption that they had a decent interval, that if you think that what's going to happen...
Yeah, this is, if what you want to have happen and what you think is going to happen are the same thing, think again.
Yeah, well, that's some of Al's wisdom with us. So I've got one last thing of my own that I want to raise with you. In addition to everything else, you and I are both political homeless people.
Yes, indeed.
We're not, we're Democrats with a small d, but we're not Democrats with a capital D. We were both appalled by Donald Trump, both right from the outset, and I'm very proud of this. Both you and I were right there at the beginning, writing these letters denouncing him, even while he was still a candidate.
We were premature never Trumpers.
Yeah. So there are a large number of people who will never forgive us for this. So we both have a long list of former friends. Do you see any future, and how do you feel about being politically homeless? I'll just say that there's a way in which it does free me to re-examine a lot of my old kind of axiomatic beliefs. And so from an intellectual point of view, there's a part of me that thinks, well, this is actually kind of liberating. But what do you think?
It is at the same time liberating, depressing, and not a little frightening. It's liberating, I agree with you, in the sense that, I don't feel like I have to justify every idiotic thing that the Republican Party does, or that I used to be a Democrat before I became Republican. Now I'm a Whig, I tell people, but, I don't feel like I didn't feel like I have to justify everything the Democrats did either. So there's that element of it. It does provide you with an opportunity to be, I think, a little bit more objective, a little bit less bound by the increasingly rigid party dicta that now have come out. And it's true on both sides, right? So, Liz Cheney's being castigated as not a Republican. She's a rhino by the Wyoming Republican Party. And Kristen Sinema's being excoriated and written out of the Democratic Party and going to be primaried in Arizona by someone, is like, really? You want to try and maintain a Senate majority, but you're going to primary your senator and, the first Democrat to win a seat there in a long time? Okay. So that, sort of the kind of liberating and depressing part. The frightening part is that our democratic republic requires two responsible parties, one center left and center right, to govern. And when those parties break down, as they did in the late 1840s and 1850s, you ended up with the biggest catastrophe in the history of the country, which was the Civil War, which killed more, as you know, more Americans than any other war, and I think than all our other wars combined. And the problem I see now is we've got one party that is problematic because it's enthralled to a minority in the party. And by that, I mean the Democrats, that the minority progressive wing of the party has managed, I think, to exert influence well beyond its strength among voters to pull the Democrats to the left. And we've got another party, which has become essentially a cult of personality, the latest evidence of which is the Politico poll this morning that shows that if Trump runs, he has 50% of support against Ron DeSantis with like 24 or 25 or something. But if Don Jr. runs, he's only 1 point behind DeSantis. They're running about even. That tells you how cultish the party has become. And not only has it become a cult, but its large elements of it have become flagrantly, openly anti-democratic. And that, I think, poses enormous peril for the republic. I hate to say it.
Yeah, I wish I could say I really disagree with you. I'm probably temperamentally more inclined to clutch at straws. So I see Eric Adams as mayor in New York, confronting, in fact, the mayor of San Francisco, even confronting some of the craziness on the Democratic left. And you see intellectually, too, the people like our friend Brian Katulis and Peter Jewell and many others sort of taking on some of the shibboleths of the left. And then on the right, again, from an intellectual point of view, there is a kind of saving remnant that's actually quite articulate and forceful.
Largely found in the Bulwark and its audience.
Yes, of course. But, you do have, you and I differed a little bit about this. I'm kind of glad that Glenn Youngkin is the face of a sort of a state party in Virginia.
You don't live in Virginia.
Yeah, well, that's true. I've got Larry Hogan, so I'm a lot happier.
Yeah, you should be
than you are. I would have been an old-fashioned New England Republican, but that's a separate screed.
Yeah, I'm not really a Whig. I think I'm a Rockefeller Republican.
Oh, I wouldn't say Rockefeller. I would say I'm sort of a Leverett Saltonstall, Charles Francis Adams, William Seward kind of Republican. But we can quibble about that.
It doesn't matter because they're both as extinct as the dodo. So,
well, let's hope that we're both really wrong on that one, because it is a concern. But I will just say it's always a joy to talk to you, Eric. It really is.
Well, I think we've probably exhausted the first year of the Biden administration. We will be back in the future with other guests and no doubt other topics to talk about. But for today, that's all from Shield of the Republic. Thank you, Eliot.
Thank you, Eric.